waste characterization is a big part of my job. It's been a big part of my life for many years. And so last year, in the height of this pandemic we're in the summer of 2020 and into the fall, when many were taking it easy, not so much the waste generation or the waste management sector, we were heavy duty into some very big studies. And so two of our clients who were brave enough to do a big study during a global pandemic are with us today. They're going to talk a little bit about the results. I'm going to start with Tim Flanagan. He's the general manager of the Monterey Regional Waste Management District. And typically people think of waste characterization studies, which is often how we do it. We characterize waste, but what's really interesting with Tim's project, he wanted to characterize incoming recyclables. And so that's something we had done. And during the pandemic, that was our 4th year in a row doing it. And so I'd like to bring in Tim. And Tim, maybe you could tell us what prompted you or what instigated looking at the composition of your incoming recyclables.
Sure, and thanks and welcome everybody today. And thanks SCS for putting on the forum for this dialogue. We're a public agency located in central Northern California. We've been in existence for a little over 70 years. In fact, this October, we celebrated our 70th anniversary. And we were so smart that we opened up our large single stream and C&D material processing facility the month that National Sword hit. That's how clever the general manager was. So one of the things that we noticed right away was the content of the single stream and how contaminated it was. And so we proffered a request for proposals, and SCS responded. And we selected SCS to do our recycling characterization survey, which is a little bit different than what maybe some other folks have had from the waste survey, because what we wanted to do was to have an understanding of what was in the recycling stream and accordingly fix charges around that. So you'll see in the screen in front of you, this is our large MRF. It underwent about a $28 million retrofit in 2016, 2017, and opened early in 2018. It's a system built by BHS, and it's performed admirably for us to this point. And down in the little right corner, you see the sorting tables that were established through this by SCS. SCS did this according to the ATSM testing standards. This is a scientifically drawn survey. We're highly confident of the results that we got from this for the last 4 years running. And we did learn some things over this period of time. So you can see here on the bar graphs coming from 2018 when we started, which was pre-pandemic, obviously, and you can see that the percent of contamination originally started out in the low 20s and hit its high during the pandemic, well above that rate. It's close to 30%, and it came down a couple of percentage points this last year. Many of the other categories you saw sort of stayed the same. The recyclable paper has increased. An estimate of that may be that that's sort of due to the Amazon effect, right, that everybody is experiencing. But we did notice that the contamination has ticked up during the 3 years intervening before the pandemic and then tapered off a little bit. So this is a very well-defined 4-year study done consistently the same way with the same team, and really gave us insight. And we use this to charge back our delivering customers based on their amount of contamination above 10%. We had a little bit of a study that showed the 4-year trend over that of what we had. And we were able then to assert very concretely with our delivering customers, 3 of which are the larger waste haulers in the area: Waste Management, Republic, Recology, as well as the collector for our area. And we were able to effectively charge back percent contamination above 10%. And they knew with real certainty that this was a scientifically derived survey. It also showed us that our education and outreach methods probably need some reworking because we haven't penetrated those consumers that continue to mistake what's coming in there. I think we have a graph that shows what the organization is of the contamination. As you can see, what's in there. And one thing that may stand out, and not just because we're in California, is textiles and leathers. That's an odd thing to end up in your single stream, but it's one of the highest ones, obviously, by weight. And the biggest problem for us, even though by weight it is not, are all the film plastics, because we spend time in our facility twice a day at least, having to stop the line, go in, cut out the film plastics from the screens in the system as they blind the screen and bind around the disc screens that separate the 2- and 3-dimensional products. So this is a real problem for us. The landfill is located right next to us, so it's not a big distance to haul it to, but still that's an awful lot of contamination in the single stream. And the SCS study that was performed for us is able to definitively track this. These are the member jurisdictions that are delivering us. You can see, I think it'll show up in the screen by color code, how some cities have done. Our best city in terms of delivering less amount of contamination is the city of Monterey. And then we have some communities. Monterey is a very rural county with a lot of ag and a lot of spread out space. And the demographics in our county are very diverse. And so we've yet to figure out a way to make our inroads to cleaning up the single stream. And this is a combination of both residential and commercial for the folks on the call. So we did not sort those really by the bars that you see there. But I would have to say that, both were equally contaminated as we went through our study. And this has really proven beneficial to us and really allowed us to have really some granularity in terms of our charging back and making penetrations to our delivering cities. So we felt that even though this is not an insignificant amount of money to invest in that the data was well worth it over the 4 years that we've done this program. And some takeaways for us for next year is that I believe that what we will end up doing is doing a waste characterization study that Stacy had mentioned earlier, and see what is bypassing the recycling system and ending up in the trash, because we feel that we still have some room to grow there as well. So anyway, thanks very much. Thanks SCS for putting this on, and I'll be happy to answer any questions when we're finished. Thanks very much.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Tim. That was interesting. I'm glad the project gave you the information you were looking for. One thing I was just going to ask you, through the course of the last 4 years, you seem kind of surprised about how textiles and leather were kind of a big portion of your contamination. Were there any other things that surprised you when you saw the data?
No, we did I would say that's the one that stood out the most. There is some organics that end up in that. That's the, the stereotypical, pizza in the pizza box and the jar of mayonnaise that gets thrown out. And we did see some of that during the pandemic, that there was an increase in folks that had perhaps over purchased in the pandemic and then threw out whole jars of tomato sauce or mayonnaise and the like. That's what some of your team saw both anecdotally and in the data. The real problem for us, though, is the film plastics. And that's really something that we want to work very hard to get on, because that does have a very direct operational cost to us that we would like to get rid of by diverting that film plastic into the waste stream where it belongs.
Yeah, the one other thing I was just going to say about your study is, there were a lot of photographs of the contamination after each sample, photographs of the contamination. And I remember as you go, you're going through, there's so many different things. People want to know like what contamination is, but you can't ever really define it. It's so many different things that you don't think of. But I remember looking at the pictures, and there was this, the blue and white Amazon envelope would appear frequently in there. It's very distinct, and you can see it. And it even has a message on there that says to recycle with plastic bags, as in not in your cart, where you take. But I don't think the public realizes that it ends up in the recyclables plenty. So
yep, that and bowling balls. How a bowling ball gets in, I have no idea. But we have anecdotal evidence of bowling balls making it into the system.
Yeah.
These people must be very poor bowlers, I guess, to have it end up in the recycling cart. So.
I know. I mean, there were things like a car bumper. I remember getting texts like a car bumper or like a motor.
Yeah.
Just oddball things. And so, yeah, you can't, a tent, things that are in contamination. And I don't know why people put it in there. I don't know. Have you thought about, like, is it more wishful recycling, or is it more people don't know, or is it more that they've run out of trash capacity, so they put it in recycling? Do you have
I'll make this a personal opinion and not the district's opinion. I personally think it's the latter. I think that the lack of space, because of the way that the metered can rates are set, that those folks, particularly during the pandemic, they did not upsize their trash carts. They were at home. All the family was at home for extended periods of time. And we noticed this both in our organics, our yard waste carts, and in our single stream carts. And this is where this would be a good subject manner for SCS to put together about metered can service versus unmetered can service. I'm happy to pick up the stick of unmetered can service to reduce contamination.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about it a lot since the pandemic. So I'm kind of on your team, even though I don't really have the data. Anyway, Tim, thanks so much for that. And
hey,
Diane?
Stacey, can I hop in and just ask a couple quick questions of Tim too? So Tim, a couple questions for you. One, do you use the data, or have you thought of using the data to also figure out like what type of new equipment you might want to incorporate into the system as like the waste ton evolves, the recyclables ton evolves? Do you want to start to target new commodities?
We did. That's a great question, Betsy. I should have probably mentioned that, in that our facility was designed really to handle both single stream and MSW. That's originally what we thought we would be processing in there, is more of the mixed stream. But as we built our facility, several of the local single stream facilities went offline. And so we ended up with about 4 times the amount of single stream that we had originally performed. So we did use the studies over those 2 years to up our equipment purchase. We actually spent close to an additional $3 million on some optical sorters that we put in the line. And one of the things that we put in there, it was indicate both in our visual assessments and with the data, was a OCC screen at the front end of the system. So yeah, that's a really good question, is that study did direct us and did help us sort of prove out, because it's, that's an expensive add-on. We had to let our board of directors know this is why we're targeting this, trying to get out there. So that's a great question, and that's part of why we use that information to draft on the equipment side.
Great. My other question is, do you internally, or have you ever done or externally have looked at what's left on your residuals line to also see, kind of how well your equipment is performing, and if you need to tweak anything, or just try to, capture everything you can?
Yeah, we have, and in California, it's a little bit unique because of its redemption system that we have. So one of the things that goes out in the residual line that has value is glass. So smaller glass is critical for us to get out, because it does have a value in California's redemption system. And that's really sort of worth its weight in gold, so to speak. And then we also think that as we upgrade our system, the residue line is perhaps a good place because of the size of the material and the speed to put a robot, as robots are becoming more and more prevalent in sorting systems, and the residue line is a good place for a robot to be in there to get some of the material that we missed through the screening systems.
Great.
Yeah, Betsy, to follow up on that, SCS has looked at other locations when there's a contractual requirement with a contracted MRF that their residuals contain no more than a certain percentage of recyclable material. So that's interesting. That's another characterization, I guess, I've seen picking up. We've done a few of those too, which is, state is just really interesting. And Betsy Powers was a project manager for a very large statewide waste characterization study we did in Wisconsin. And so I've invited Casey Lamensky, who is with the Solid Waste Program for Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Casey, welcome. And I thought I would ask you the same question. You're managing a very large statewide waste characterization study. I know Wisconsin had done one, I think maybe 10 years ago, but what prompted your organization to want another statewide?
Sure. So we did have statewide studies conducted in 2002 and 2009 previously, with the aims of continuing to conduct this full-scale statewide study about every 10 years. And the timing of that is basically when we can get funding, and no guarantee that it would be there in a future year. So pandemic or not,
yeah, right.
This was the year. But a lot of the reasons why we want that data, of course, would be to look at trends from previous years, both to understand what is being generated, but also different types of policy initiatives or legislative initiatives or communication efforts, how they are working to change what we're seeing in our waste stream, so we can make sure we're focusing our time and effort on the most successful items, and also looking at what is the largest component of the waste stream, especially the largest components that we have the infrastructure or the technology to eliminate from the landfill waste stream, so that we know, that's worth focusing on. And I think a big part of our goals with this study in particular were really to make the case that waste is a climate concern. That is something I think the waste industry really understands well, but I don't think that message has gotten out, and it is much easier to make that message when you have numbers and then can use those numbers to conduct modeling, which is what we did with a lot of our data, to say, here is the greenhouse gas emissions where, we are putting in our landfill or generating by our landfill operations by not, diverting organics. And that helps us make a much bigger policy case for our waste program.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. That's really good to know. Casey, you could walk us through a little bit of your of the results from your study. Sure.
Yeah, these slides go through some of the data points we're using the most, and just as a bit of an example of why we made sure to collect that data and what SCS was able to provide. That ended up being the most useful. So it was a large statewide study. We were able to get 15 different collection points that were 72% of the state's MSW stream, and covered all 5 what we consider regions of the state. And that helps us to make sure our study is representative. And also, one thing that was important for us is if we wanted to look at regional data, that we had at least 2 host facilities from each region in our state, because we needed to make sure, we are a regulatory agency as well, that this was not a compliance mechanism, so that we got the most accurate data. And so we were only seeing data from aggregate from at least more than 1 facility, even when we broke it down by region. And we actually had sites volunteering, wanting to know if they could also participate if they weren't selected, because the studies want the data that we're collecting, or the sites want the data we're collecting for their own uses as well. A great example is from our last study. Our Dane County used the data specific from the sort at their facility that they received to properly size construction and demolition recycling facility that they're successfully using today. So this study was 398 samples. Once again, that number came from SCS to give us a representative sample. And it was based on the amount of MSW each of those sites were taken. So it wasn't uniform sampling at each of those. The biggest part of what we were working on as the state agency hiring it out and putting out the request for proposal was the waste categories. And unfortunately for SCS, we landed on 85 different waste categories that we were interested in looking at. And there was a lot of reasons that 85 categories ended up happening. And a few that, I think maybe we would pay a little bit more attention to now that we've done the study, including making sure that our categories match different categories that we want to use for modeling or financial estimates, making sure that they match federal categories so that we can do comparisons. Of course, we were looking at trying to match some of our categories from past studies. And then also making sure that we can line categories up with our beneficial use of industrial byproducts and our recycling programs. So this is a look at what's being landfilled, but not what's being generated. And so we need to tell that as part of the picture as well. And so what could these numbers be added to? And then the study did cost $335,000. Which is a big amount of money for our solid waste program, but as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, really needing the numbers to make a case for our program to move forward new initiatives and to know where we're going, and so definitely worth it. And a part of this too is that our Department of Natural Resources has set a climate goal for a % food waste reduction by 2030, which is becoming pretty common. And it's very hard to set a food waste reduction goal by % without knowing your starting numbers. So that was incredibly important in getting our numbers as well. I'll just say also, yes, so we did do it during a pandemic year. One thing that I think helped is that we did it across 2 different seasons within, a couple months apart. So we didn't have any one, event that was maybe too highly represented. But we just know that, a lot of the changes we saw from the pandemic likely will be, what is happening moving forward, an increase in cardboard, like Tim alluded to, as more people ship from home, or just, more waste generated from the residential sector than the commercial sector. And so we know that, the data is a snapshot in time. It also is showing us a lot of trends that we'll be looking at long term. Oh, yes, sorry, just taking a look at what's next in the slides there. I noted that we did, want to be able to compare to national numbers, which we were able to with our categories. But, with our individual 85 categories, we came out with this chart that doesn't exactly line up as our main sections. And that was to compare to past studies, but if we were starting that we had done, but if we were starting to study our own, I think we would specifically try and match the EPA categories for a more direct comparison on how we're doing. So, one of the main things that we're looking at is just what are the largest items that are being landfilled. Amazingly, even when you divide it into 85 different categories and we split wasted or food waste into two categories for this one, which is wasted food that was traditionally edible food waste, and one food scraps, which are not traditionally edible. Even split up, they came in at number 1 and number 3 of the highest items being landfilled in Wisconsin by weight. 14.5% wasted food, 6% food scraps. We also see the really high flexible films, which are continuing to rise, and textiles. So clearly some overlap with the recycling contamination.
You know, one thing I was just going to add, Casey, is, you know, like I've looked at many waste characterization studies. We've conducted many, and usually we don't see textiles being in the top 5 categories. And I thought that was, I mean, we see it here and there in contamination, but this year, you know, both the Monterey and your study were conducted during the pandemic. And I know that thrift stores and other organizations were closed. And it's really interesting to me that that textiles suddenly made it into kind of a top contaminant in recycling. And it also became one of the top components in the waste stream. And that's unusual. We usually don't see that. That's new. And I'm curious, as we continue doing waste characterization, to see if we're going to see that trend stop or level off, go back to the way it was, or if that's something new we're going to see in the waste stream. So
sure.
I thought that was really interesting, actually, for both of the studies.
Yeah, I was surprised to see it that high too. I think, you know, it speaks a lot to the importance of those donation and reuse facilities, and also, you know, a good message that I know we haven't focused on a lot, of just, you know, especially if we're trying to climb up the pyramid to reduction, of just keeping, you know, single use or, you know, very use it and throw it away textiles as a messaging that really hasn't been touched, at least by our agency, before.
Right. Yeah, good point.
Our top 5 items over the last 3 studies. So it was important to us to at least be able to, well, we had more categories in this study, so we couldn't break down exactly the same top 5, that we could combine them with others to be able to see the trends over time. And you see those big rises in food waste and flexible film as we map our own statewide trends. Our study also included a visual characterization for construction and demolition waste, which the visual characterization is the standard procedure. It's just too bulky to hand sort, but you actually do a lot more samples then to get the good data. But one thing that we were looking at a lot was just the comparison from our previous study to see what had changed in these categories. One that we were very happy to see was, if you see in the 2009 study, the number 1 component of construction and demolition waste was roofing shingles. And it's down 20% in our most recent study, down to just 10%. And that is something that there wasn't a lot of policy change for, but markets developed to use, you know, roofing shingles since our last study in asphalt roads. And because, you know, almost all of our transfer facilities started collecting shingles, a lot of businesses started sorting operations, and hot mix asphalt plants started using all of these shingles. And so that was one that was just very industry driven, and it was good to see the success of that operation. Speaking of just like the results that mattered to us, here's a look. We did see, we have like basically 4 different categories that we broke all of recyclables into, when depending on the message we're trying to make. We have 17% of our recyclables of the materials being landfilled are actually a part of our landfill ban. 19% are recyclable through all curbside programs. 34% are recyclable through curbside or drop off, which includes that textile number. And 64% of everything that's being landfilled is recyclable in some area of Wisconsin. So a lot of that is, once you start including the few food waste compost sites we have, that bumps that number up a lot. But it just shows the potential. Once again, the reason we needed all of those waste categories, because a lot of it is different messaging. And we also then valued the 19% of recyclables that are available in everyone's curbside bins that were landfilled at $87 million in 2020. And using the warm modeling, if we would have recycled all those materials, and that's the EPA's warm modeling, instead of landfilling them, it would have saved enough energy to power 219,000 homes for a year. So those are, not just the numbers in our study, but quantifying that outside of just waste numbers is really important in what we're looking for in this data. And getting the numbers from the study in a sortable spreadsheets, which SCS also provided to us, was really impactful. And like I said, we're really looking at big changes. We saw huge increase in recyclables, so we know we really need to double down on that messaging, which we probably really haven't changed much of since 1992 when our landfill ban went into effect. So probably time to refresh everyone on that. Food waste is going to be a big focus of ours moving forward. We did see the industry success with shingles, and then in 2011 we passed e-cycle legislation banning TVs and other electronics from the landfill. And that was great to see because we saw an 85% reduction in TVs as combined with an EPR law. So, that also shows us the success that was made that way. And then, we had got this great report. It is very data rich, and there are a ton of things that you can mine from it. But not everyone is able to take the time. So we really took our time before actually releasing the result once we got the report to do a lot of this modeling, and then to create some tools like this. This is an infographic that our team made, trying to take some of the biggest takeaway messages and make them bite-sized for not just the industry, but we wanted it to be used by any industry user, or any just household user or municipal user as well, to understand the importance of, why we spent all this money on a waste sort. And this was really helpful. And that in the food waste message, we ended up with about a dozen media interviews when we released the results of our study. And one of the media interviews ended up being sold on the AP wire. So I know just our results in Wisconsin got picked up by about 20 major cities across the country in their metro news. And so we were really happy with just, being able to share our message that way. And I think part of it is breaking down the study into some more consumable bites. And that's kind of what I have for what we got out of our study.
Well, thank you, Casey. That was really interesting. And it's good to see when we do these studies how well used they are. And I think you hit on a point. A lot of people can speculate what's in the waste stream, but until you get the real data, it's actual, it's proven, it's hard to just make a case based on, oh, we see it often. We see a lot of cardboard. How much? And oftentimes people don't know that. I'm curious, I know Tim mentioned, he did recycling, but they've done, waste characterization before, and he's thinking his future might be going to, maybe in the future they'll do more of a waste characterization. Do you think you will look at maybe in the future looking at recyclables or maybe organics? Would that be something you would think your organization would look at maybe statewide, or do you think maybe more locally?
I think, if we, like I said, we have this food waste goal by 2030, we would definitely need to do benchmarking before 2030 to see how we're tracking and what other steps need to be made for that goal. And so we'd definitely be looking at something like that. I think recycling, especially, you know, as contamination becomes or has become more of a problem, and we're really trying to increase education in, you know, stopping wish cycling and really getting to the core materials that we know can get recycled, that it would be very helpful. I'm not sure if we will necessarily be able to swing it, having just done the full statewide waste one anytime soon. But I will say that, you know, this is now just hearsay as of what we see. There's no hard numbers to it, but if we did our sort study, you would get in Wisconsin a lot of pictures this time of year of people putting their deer carcasses in their recycling.
Yeah. I mean, that is so disappointing when you see something like that, and I have seen that before too. So, yeah, that is disappointing.
Excuse me, I just wanted to ask, we had a question come through the chat, and the question is to Tim and Casey both. The attendee asks, were there any links in the increase in textiles disposed with a decrease in donation centers, their ability to process or receive during COVID? Do you think that was potentially an impact?
I don't know, Tim, if you have a quick answer, I could give my long answer.
Sure, I can give a, we've had a reuse store operating in our landfill called the Last Chance Mercantile since the early 90s, which we had to close under California regulations early in the pandemic. And we were just able to open it up actually under a renewed management collaboration with the Veterans Transition Center this July. So I do think there is a nexus between the closure of the donation centers and, you know, those in the recycling stream. Although it had been present in earlier sort studies, is if you go back and check the SCS data, you can see that there was actually, you know, more than you know, a small percentage of textiles present in the recycling stream, even though there are a number of not only our option, but other smaller donation centers as well. And I'm not quite sure why that is. I don't have an answer for that, but definitely the closure of those facilities, I do believe, created a uptick in the percentage we receive.
And I would say, I don't know, which is also a good opportunity of just thinking about what you want to do with your results. You know, we don't have data from the donation facilities at the state level to know if they actually saw a decrease, but there are a lot of questions as, you know, how did the pandemic affect your data? Why are you seeing more recyclables when everyone has access to them? That, you know, the characterization study is not telling us, it's giving us the numbers. One thing that we did is, while we were collecting data for the characterization study, we also did a household recycling survey that was more on habits, which I really encourage, you know, maybe doing something like that in conjunction, so we can say, we saw this great increase in, not great, large, bad, a large increase in recyclables. And the reason people are telling us, the number one reason now that they're saying they're not recycling, is because they think it ends up in the landfill anyway. So knowing that we really need to work on that messaging. So, you know, doing some other studies. One other is that we're getting a lot of people saying, as we try to increase our household food waste messaging, saying that, yes, it's substantial, but it's probably all from grocery stores and restaurants anyway. My household impacts aren't making a big difference. And we don't have the numbers on that, but looking nationally, it seems about 40% of food waste is actually coming from the residential level. And, you know, when we've been able to share those numbers, people are really surprised. So something that we'll look in future food waste is definitely getting a survey of disposal facilities for the percent that they're getting from residential and ICI sector, so that we can answer that more fully. So just, you know, keeping in mind when you get these numbers, if you want to know the why, there's probably further surveys, you know, and questions to ask, and to try and sync up those times is really helpful.
One of the questions, Tim, and you kind of touched on it with regards to the potential in the modifications you did make to your processing system. I don't know if you could drill into that a little bit. I was involved with a project up in Maine where that was an ongoing process where you got all this, the big, like you said, the big thing was film. How can I get this film out of my world, and what process, what sequence of the various processes can I do to get that film out of there? I'm just curious what you all actually, what you did.
Well, that's a good question, Bob. One of the things we found is, again, some of it would have design element if we, in terms of the way the numbers were, the system was designed to process 80,000 tons of MSW and about 15,000 tons of single stream. And in essence, we ended up with close to 65,000 tons of single stream. So our system really now is devoted almost entirely one shift per day to single stream. We're not processing any MSW. But one of the things that we did in cooperation with BHS, as a result of the recycling surveys that we did with SCS, is that it told us that it would be worth our while to put a downstream optical sorter for the film plastic to remove that after the containers have been separated, and to separate that film plastic from the fiber stream. So, that was not an insignificant expense to put in an optical sorter there, but that did lead us to that would, sort of pay for itself relatively quickly by diverting, that film plastic, where there really isn't a very good way to do it with human interaction. It really has to be done, mechanically. So that data did serve that purpose to do that. And even though we could see that and sort of assess that visually, having the data in the system itself helped make a stronger case to our board and helped us run sort of the project economics that if we could call out. And it has been effective in diverting a substantial amount of that film out of the fiber line, which is sort of at the back end of our system. I don't know if that answered the question as completely as you had organized it.
It was a perfect answer, Tim.
One thing, Casey, I wanted to ask you, it looks like you said your last waste characterization was 2009, and then this one in 2020, 2021. How long do you think it'll be before your next one? Another 10 years, you think, or?
I think probably for the statewide, that seems to be what we're going to be able to do. But as I mentioned before, I think we're probably going to have to do some smaller looks that are probably food waste specific if we want to really be meeting those goals. I know Minnesota Pollution Control Agency just did waste characterization for food waste, specifically to see the effects of their metro policy changes and goals that will be coming out in a couple of weeks. That, they're also looking at doing a statewide waste characterization study, but some smaller scales for that benchmarking in between. But based on the interest at both just with residents and with our industry, who are all chomping at the bit to get the results, perhaps we'll be able to make the case, especially if we make some big policy shifts, to have something sooner than 10 years.
Okay.
Casey, for other statewide waste characterization studies, have you seen any sort of a different cadence than about 10 years?
Well, California seems to do them more frequently. They're kind of an outlier, more than 10 years, but I would say other states seem to be running around the 10-year plus or minus a few years, which seems standard. I think California might, I think between the last one and the one before, I think it was only like 3 years, maybe. So
AC, that's the nicest thing anybody's called us Californians, is an outlier. So thanks.
Well, I mean, in California, for people who aren't in California, they're enacting some pretty, major legislation to divert, food scraps. So there is a lot of work involved in implementing that, planning for it, and that involves a lot of characterization studies. So I know, Tim, you probably have something in the works coming up for organics, but
well, actually, for the folks on the call, California is prescriptively required us to do lid flipping, which is to actually interrogate all of your carts at your curb and stick your head in there and see what's in there and document that, and then report back to the state. So it's created some interesting challenges from some folks. The state has the right legally to do that, but it will be interesting to see what the results from that organic analysis does, which is really, right out in the field, right at the home, to see what happens.
Yeah, well, that is interesting, and it comes up to the point of like measuring, like a site, and how do you give a measure to that, to how much it weighs. We have a question. I don't know if any of you know this, one that came through. What was the landfill gas generation prognosis for this new garbage versus the landfill gas generated 10 years ago? Which is probably more for Casey, since you did the waste characterization 10 years.
Sure. I'm not positive if the question is, does the waste 10 years ago generate more or less waste relative to new waste, or the amount. I'll kind of try and answer both. So the increase in organic material going to our landfills, that from what we saw from our 2009 study, definitely means more landfill gas is being generated. In Wisconsin, using modeling for all of our landfills, including closed landfills, I believe our gas collection is typically collecting about 78%, we believe, of landfill gas being generated. So, a small amount of that is going to gas to energy. Unfortunately, a lot of it is being flared. But, so the amount that is generated is increasing, but, amount released should be less of an increase because of the collection systems, and those are changing and getting better always with time. Also, older food waste or any organic material tends to spike in gas generation and then decline. I don't know when exactly it drops, but in Wisconsin it's faster than a lot of states because we do leachate recirculation. So we're getting most of the gas generation from organic materials, or the highest levels in those first couple of years, now that we started recirculation. But 10 years ago, maybe not so much. So it definitely is increasing, but we're doing our best to collect it.
Thank you for that. Moving forward, I guess one thing I'm just curious, Tim, when you do a waste characterization study, do you think you'll have 80 categories, or do you think you'll keep it to like maybe 30? I don't know. And then Casey, I was going to follow that up with like, how valuable do you think having 85 categories was? Do you think that was a valuable thing? I guess, go ahead, Tim.
I think for our answer, I actually think it'll align, and that's a good question. We haven't processed that completely, but I think we'll line it, Stacy, pretty close to what we did on the recycling characterization study, because for us, the information will inform us what is bypassing us to the landfill, which, like in our case, is literally 500 yards away, that we could interdict and have driven into our material processing facility in either the construction demolition side or the single stream recycling side. So my guess is that we'll leave Wisconsin the winner at 85 categories, and maybe we'll be more like Baskin Robbins around 31 flavors, I think. So
Interesting. How about you, Casey?
I think, for our main points that we are making now, 85 categories is not necessary. A lot of the category sorts are very specific, but I think, we only get to do this every 10 years. Some of these materials, are like, we didn't know that plastic pouches needed to be its own category 10 years ago. And now, we're seeing them really, factor in heavily. And so, we're trying to get that information and make sure that, anyone who wants to use this data, whether it's a business, wanting to cite and, a facility in Wisconsin, and they need to know specifically what materials they can accept. We want it to be usable to them. As noted, we need to fit into all these different categories for comparing our data with our, what we collect recycling and different types of modeling. And so, yes, it seems excessive, and I'm sure the sorters, SCS did a great job, but they trained their sorters that they hired by material category. So everyone doesn't have to know 85 categories. They got to know their plastics or their paper products and, went from there. So we feel better about the data. And we, of course, had some like small hand sort items that are, tires and sharps and certain types of batteries that, we just know are problematic in the landfill that we really wanted specific numbers on, that are small items. So yes, not ideal, but I think we were just trying to cover all of our bases.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point because, different needs for different clients. And I always like to, encourage anyone on who's listening in, who's thinking of doing a waste characterization. I mean, the devil's in the details, you got to think about how you want to use the data, what information you want to collect. If you want to compare it to someone else, another study, a federal study, another state, another jurisdiction, it's the small devil, like how you classify some of our plastics and papers that can be difficult to do a direct comparison. Anyway, just food for thought if you're thinking of embarking on something like this.
I wanted to add to my landfill gas comment really quick. I don't know what it is in 2009, I should compare, but the landfill or the greenhouse gas emissions, not landfill gas, but generated, we know from our 2020 study, was 2.8 million tons of greenhouse gas or CO2 equivalents, which is the equivalent of taking almost 600,000 vehicles off the road for a year. So that's, again, some modeling that we did on why waste is a climate issue.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Casey, for that.
Yeah, public agency, so all our information is searchable. You would want to just log on to MRWMD.org. That stands for Monterey Regional Waste Management District.org. Or if you just Google that, you'll find us. We have a icon to draw in our board meetings and agendas, and you can search from there. And if you get lost, you can always reach out to me or my board clerk, Ida Gonzalez, and we'll help you. And we do have those studies. They are searchable and they are compiled by SCS. So those are free and available for review.
And for Wisconsin, if you go to dnr.wi.gov, you will find our DNR homepage. And then if you search either waste sort or waste characterization study, it'll bring you to the web page we have on it, including the infographic, a few pullouts, and then it actually has all three of our studies linked to on that page, and as well as some additional modeling that we did.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I hope people who are tuning in, got a good idea of what a waste characterization study can do for you. It's not just waste anymore. It's recycling, it's organics, it's residuals, we're sorting everything. So, and it's the best way to know what's in there and get the data. So I want to thank our panelists, Tim Flanagan and Casey Lamensky, for giving us your insights and telling us about how you use the data and your your future ideas for where your program's going to go. So we really appreciate your time and sharing your experience with us.